All right, all right. So here today we have Josh Morris from Homestead Ranger. I've done a YouTube video on his place. It was fantastic, well received. So today I wanted to get a little bit more in depth with Josh and get an understanding a little bit more in depth. People had some questions, so we want to bring all this up and Josh to share. So yeah, let me bring in Josh, everyone.
Hey everybody, great to be here. Can you hear me all right?
Yep, I hear you perfect. Take it away, Josh.
All right, so basically today I just wanted to share with everyone a little bit about what we've been doing over the past 15 years really in the Missouri Ozarks. And it's been a busy lifestyle. It's been a great lifestyle, but we've started by moving off grid with our family. We have 3 children, currently between the ages of 8 and 21. And so 15 years ago, we had a 6-year-old and a 1-year-old moving off grid. And the reasons that we made such a big change in our lifestyle were many. I think whenever a person decides to make a huge change, they say, "Why did you do it?" And there's never one reason. You normally have a few big reasons that push you to do something that requires a lot of investment in time and labor. And so our reasons were we wanted to be able to be more self-sufficient. We kind of felt that the world at the time was becoming a little detached from your basic needs, from your supply chains, and we wanted instead to really put our hands on those things that we needed for survival. We wanted to produce our own food, wanted to have direct access to clean, fresh, non-polluted water that came off of our property, and then we even built our own shelter and produced our own energy over time. And so basically, I can tell you more about that, and then if there's anyone that chat that has comments while I'm going, I'd be more than happy. Don't worry about interrupting or anything. I can see the comments, so if you'd like to just ask a question at any time, go right ahead. Okay, so you can see I've got my website here. Looks like the slide it might look a little distorted from what I originally did, but it's at homesteadranger.com. I've got more resources and information, and then as was mentioned, I also have my book. It's Thrive in the Coming Dark Age: How to Build the Ultimate Survival Homestead. And the best place to get that's on Amazon. And the book really, it's not just a how-to, but it's also a story about how our family went off grid and all of the challenges that we faced, some of the mistakes, some of the successes, some of the good times, and some of the hard times of moving our family off grid. And then there's a lot of information about why we did it and how I feel that this lifestyle is going to be a more sustainable way for you to move yourself and your loved ones into a future where you might very well find yourself needing to get closer to your supply chain and your necessities. So, a couple things about how we set up our homestead. One of the questions that I get from a lot of people are, how do you make that leap, and how do you jump off grid and be able to afford this? And that is probably the hardest part about it, because if you are starting with zero financial resources, you're going to have to build up a platform to make that leap. So, for example, in our case, my previous career was with the United States military. When I grew up, I did not have any kind of path financially, to go to college, or I was also from a really small rural town. My dad was a coal miner who also got laid off. And so for me, I started from zero with as far as financial resources go. And so the military was kind of my springboard. And, I'll just say briefly, that's kind of a rough way to go. It's also it's also risky. I was in the Ranger community during the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. So not necessarily what I would recommend, but I would recommend that you do have some kind of a springboard and some kind of way to build up a nest egg before you go and you try to go into a sustainable agriculture enterprise or move off grid. And then once we started that, the financial part of it, is as unpleasant as it might be, that continued to be important for us. So we ended up building different enterprises on our farm that complemented each other. And the primary one became beef cattle. We actually started off with bison and then later moved into beef cattle. And it really wasn't our original plan to raise beef cattle, but the local economy where we live in the Missouri Ozarks is really geared towards that. And so it made it easy for us to focus on the health of the animals, the care for animals, feeding them, raising them, and then being able to take advantage of the economy that was already existing to market those beef cattle. And so while we started off thinking about having huge enterprises and maybe raising grapes for wine or elderberries or even large orchards with nuts and fruit, really in the end we ended up taking advantage of the economy that was already in our area. And then we found that there were other enterprises that we could incorporate onto the farm that would complement the beef cattle enterprise, specifically meat goats. We started raising meat goats. So the beef cattle, the bison and then beef cattle was starting, about 15 years ago. And then the meat goats was just a couple years later, about 13 years ago. And we found that we were able to rotate those animals into the same pastures, and the cattle would eat more of the grass. The meat goats would trim up more of the leafy plants. And that meant that we didn't have to go out and try to do any kind of what people call weed control. Instead of weeds, we ended up with, vegetation that was beneficial to the goats, and then, grass being beneficial to the cattle. So they had this symbiotic relationship. And then whenever they were fully able to harvest all of the growing pasture and forages, and then turn that into a manure, which is your fertilizer, then that kind of completes the cycle. And then you get more forage and more rich grass that grows. And so I'll get into that a little bit more. Also, a big thing initially on our farm was raising livestock guardian dogs. So after the meat goats, we had dogs, primarily Anatolians, and basically a family of dogs out there. And then they would raise puppies, and then we would train the puppies. And then those puppies would go to other farms and be guardians for either goats or sheep on other farms. And we've gotten out of raising and training the livestock guardian dogs as much now, but when we were in those early years of just trying to make ends meet and trying to make the farm pay for itself, that was kind of a value-added product, because it wasn't just like selling an animal. You're selling a worker. A livestock guardian dog is trained to work on the farm. So this is what people always want to know about. How did you make this happen financially? Because that really is what stops most people. And those were the ways in our area. And now also on there, I put occasional as raised bed gardens. So one of the things that we did along the way, it's been a long journey, and people are like, how do you market this stuff? And I'll tell them, I market my products wherever I can get the most money for my product and for the work that I'm doing. And so when I put raised bed gardens on there, that supplemented income at a farmer's market. And so we had a small farmer's market in our area when we moved here. We worked with one of the other farms and turned it into a bigger farmer's market. We got a downtown space that was dedicated. Our farm and one other farm worked together to do that, and even got a USDA grant to have a structure with a roof for the farmer's market. So in addition to the livestock and livestock guardian dogs, our raised bed gardens, which I'll get into more, were so productive that they were able to kind of boost the income at the farmer's market. Now, I put some of this other stuff in not-for-profit, and because in the end, while we tried some of these other enterprises, there was something that in our case, at least, we found we were not able to make profitable, and I'll explain why. So first of all, honeybees is on there. And the reason that I found that honeybees were not profitable in our area is because we have a lot of fungus because of our more humid or rainy conditions and our particular weather patterns. And those funguses will encourage different parasites to live in the bee colonies. And so while you can certainly raise honey, you can put a lot of effort into it, especially if you're willing to use chemicals and things like that. The quantity of honey that you can produce in our area, it's not particularly suited. So the lesson is just to keep in mind what works in your area. And if you see other people doing it successfully, that's one clue. Maybe you can break out into a new area that no one's doing, a new enterprise that no one's doing in your geographic location. But in our case, honeybees doesn't work real well on a big scale here. Now you see the raised bed gardens again, which I mentioned, yes, profitable. And then on the other hand, I put it not for profit because there was so much more intrinsic value to our raised beds than there was economic value. So while the livestock was producing big chunks of cash, almost like an investment, or a return on investment was great for livestock. The raised bed gardens was just a supplemental enterprise that helped while we were doing the farmers market. And then later when we started selling more breeding stock from our animal herds, and we stopped doing the farmers market because we scaled up basically, and so the farmers market was too small scale. Then the raised bed gardens were very important for our family, not for profit, but for the health of our family. And I'll get into that a little bit more. It's one of our favorite aspects of the homestead because we're able to have fresh vegetables for our family, and which is something that really keeps you healthy throughout the year. Also on there, we've raised pork, and that again is really great for your family to have your own meat. And honestly, it's a great thing when you have children who are young teenagers. I'd say from 7, 8 years old all the way up to young teenagers to be able to raise pork or pigs on your farm. And I don't think it's particularly profitable because the pork industry has sort of gone into mass production and industrial scale, which is difficult to compete with. Even your pork that is more organic or has less, treatments and hormones is being done on a large scale. So the prices of the meat are low. But as far as not for profit and intrinsic value, especially if your children can help out in raising the pigs, then that's a great enterprise to go. Yeah, I see a question about the goats on there. I'm going to answer that real quick. On the chickens, I'll say we also found that was similar to the pork, where it's done on a huge scale for profit, and there are a lot of Amish farms that do that successfully around us. But for us, the intrinsic value of having your own farm fresh eggs was totally worth it. Now, the goats, as far as being a real economic engine and a contributor for allowing us to do things. The question was, how much did we make from the goats? That's one of the most surprising things that people can hardly believe, and that is, let's see. I'll actually go to the next slide because they're on there. So our goat enterprise actually became just as profitable as cattle. However, the upfront investment was much less. For example, whenever you buy a beef cow, say an Angus, a female, and let's say you're purchasing that cow for $2,000, and you can get a $1,000 calf off of that female every year. If you're grass fed, you're only going to spend maybe, especially like us, we produce our own hay, so maybe you spend $200 on that calf, so you're making an $800 profit. That's a 40% profit on cows. So 40% on cows. Now, a lot of times on our goats, we would buy, and we got in early, so we were able to buy a lot of our registered goats for between $400 and $1,000 for one female goat, and then the market actually went up quite a bit, and so that goat might produce 2 or 3 kids per year, and we were getting $500 to $1,500, so say an average of $1,000 per goat kid, but then an average of like 2 goat kids per female. So like if a female costs $1,000, and then we were getting $2,000 of revenue off of that goat. We call them does. Some people like to call them nannies, but doe makes it sound like it's more expensive and more valuable. So since we're selling it, we call them goat does. But a goat doe that's $1,000 can produce $2,000 worth of kids every year. And so you're talking about, you can even spend, $200, $300 on that goat, which she eats less than a cow, but you can just feed her gourmet food, and you're still making like a $1,800 on 1,000. So that's 180% return on your investment for goats. And as far as the question about how they were being sold and how the prices have gone up. So yeah, initially we were selling some of them as meat goats, and we tried those types of markets. And then later and currently, they're almost all being sold as breeding stock. You'll select some that aren't quite up to par. Maybe they didn't get the genetic traits that you wanted, but most of them that we sell are sold as breeding stock. So you're going to get, 3-4 times higher price. I mentioned $1,000 each. That's pretty easy for breeding stock. And then if you're just selling them for meat, it could be just $200 to $300. So yeah, we ended up going towards the breeding stock. And the question is, why are the prices so high? And the reason that they've gone up was really probably 2 or 3-fold. COVID was a terrible thing, but for the goat market, COVID was a wonderful thing, because all of a sudden everyone wanted to get out of the city so they weren't living on top of each other. And, we had 11 or 12 years head start on everyone on getting out of the city. So that was nice. We had our farm set up. But when we had neighbors or people in our region that moved into farms and they had 5 acres, 10 acres, 15 acres, one of the easiest classes of livestock for them to purchase were goats. And so during the COVID years, and especially 2020, 2021, and we've got quite a momentum still from then, but 2020, 2021, prices were going up so fast that my girls who do a lot of my marketing, my daughters, would say, this price is too high. Last year you would have got $800, and now you're asking, $2,000 for this adult doe. And I said, yeah, you're probably right. Maybe it's a little bit too high. They'd put the doe for sale out there on a goat Facebook group, and then it would sell in like 10 minutes. And, even though the price was almost triple what we used to get, I would think, oh, well, I didn't ask enough money for this goat. It sold in only 10 minutes. So it's kind of just timing to where the goat market really took off. It's cooled down just a little since COVID. Now, we're, almost 5 years later at this point. So it's cooled down a little, but there's been another tailwind that's really driven and boosted the goat market. And that is, it's become a trend, and it's become really popular for a lot of children and young teenagers to show goats at county fairs, and even show goats at regional fairs or regional competitions. Especially the American Boer Goat Association is something that we've taken part in, and taken part in some of those shows. And so that sort of cultural trend has also been a tailwind to boost the goat market. So that's been really exciting and fun to be part of. And everything has really come together in such a great way, especially considering the fact that when you have a cattle operation, your goats, instead of being an expense or a liability, they're just a real benefit. It's like having a crew of workers out there trimming up your pastures. They go and they eat the brambles off of the fences. They'll trim up the low hanging branches from your trees in the area. So there's just so many reasons that goats are a great addition to the farm. So after I talked about the financial enabling of the homestead lifestyle, basically how can you actually support it financially, I didn't want to just leave it there as if that was the end goal or the end state. I want to really point out that whenever you're in the process, it doesn't feel like you're just chasing after the dollar. Instead, it really feels like you are taking care of the land and being a steward of the land. And so if you focus on that, I think that everything else will follow. And so in our case, the ways that we have built soil on our property on a large scale in the pastures, so you have your macro or your large scale, that's your pasture lands, and then you have your micro, which is like your gardens and your raised beds. So first I'll tell you about how we did it on the macro, on the large scale. And the way that we did that was basically by rotating livestock. In the wild, you're going to have grazing herds that are rotating and moving, and they're being sort of pushed along by predators, and then they're also constantly grazing out and running out of forage where they're at, so they're going to move. And then you fence these animals up in a domestic herd, and all of a sudden they get slowed down and bogged down, and they stay on one spot until they ruin that vegetation. So you can't allow that to happen. So instead, what you want to do is you rotate them frequently. And for us, we went to classes that the USDA gives, and I read about some of Joel Salatin's techniques where you do what they call management intensive grazing. And quite honestly, we call it a lot of times labor intensive grazing, because we're out there every day, like obsessive compulsively rotating our cattle. And at first, you're thinking, how am I spending so much of my life out on these pastures? This is a big change for me. And then later, it becomes part of your natural rhythms and something that you almost need to do. Like your body needs to get out there on the land and sort of be a part of nurturing that land. And when you're rotating your animals, you're actually watching this happen. You're seeing that it's basically rapid composting of your pastures, because they're consuming that vegetation, and then the manure fertilizer is feeding the soil. So you're taking your large pieces of land and you're rapid composting on top of that, and it also speeds up your mineral cycle, increases biodiversity, and you end up having, instead of just financial capital, you're building up your biological capital. And so you end up with sort of a symbiosis. All right. So I see there's another question on here, and I want to make sure I address that before I move on. So what I'll do is I'll back up, because this is a good spot to pause and look at so I've been talking about the pastures and how you make that sustainable, and how you basically become a steward of that. And so this question was, if you have an EMP, so I'll go into sustainable energy real quick. Will your solar panels still work, or will they get fried? And then in a nuclear winter, how is your energy production going to look for your solar panels? And then, it looks like the person asking the question is also real concerned about nuclear fallout and stuff. And I am too. And so I'll just take a moment and after talking about pastures to talk about your sustainable home and your sustainable energy and how that relates to disaster preparedness. And so, first of all, just get an overview is that we have somewhere between 8 and 9 kilowatts of hourly capacity for our solar panels. Those were totally off grid for like 14 and a half years. And then we had so many solar panels that we decided, hey, why don't we have a DC transfer switch and I had an opportunity to really cheaply, almost free, get the power to come into the power lines to come into our property. And so now we can take those solar panels and we can switch them over to the grid, and it can pay for excess energy, and you can have some more modern conveniences, electric vehicle or hot tub or whatever you want. But anyways, the base where we started for 14 years was to be completely off grid. And so with 8 to 9 kilowatts of hourly production, in the wintertime, you can reliably produce 30, 40 kilowatts per day, which is enough to run, refrigerator, freezer. In the summertime, you're producing more, so you can also run an air conditioner in your house. Just like a window unit is actually a really low load for your electrical system. Okay, so that's something we do, and it's just the same way that you want to produce your own food. You're able to produce your own electricity, so you're not relying on other people. And also, one of the intrinsic value parts of that is your children will then learn that they need to turn lights off and conserve energy, and that, oh my gosh, when I use the hairdryer in the middle of the winter, it actually does use a lot of electricity. So they're aware of their footprint, basically. Now, as far as extreme disaster preparedness, all of this stuff worked very well during COVID. It would work really well during an economic downturn to keep you and your family safer, and to be able to rely on yourselves. Now, in the event of an EMP, and then the audience here has asked about a nuclear strike. So my first book was more, the Thrive in the Coming Dark Age was more conventional type of preparedness. And it's interesting that you asked the question about nuclear, because I've really been trying to work my way and working really hard and doing a lot of research on nuclear preparedness as well, just because the proliferation of any technology almost seems inevitable once it gets started, and nuclear proliferation has not slowed down, although we ignore it more than we used to. But the EMP question is very similar to the nuclear question, because they use similar types of technologies. And so will the solar panels work if you get hit by an EMP? It's sort of a magnitude question and location question. So some people's would be fried and some people's would not. I've worked as a solar installer before, and I've had to fix lightning strike problems. And what you end up having is there's a diode in each solar panel, which costs about $5. And so I think a lot of times, if in EMP, what you would expect is for that diode to get fried. And so if you have solar panels, if you'll figure out what kind of diode they have that'll fit in the back of that solar panel, then you can keep those on hand and a little solder gun, and you could actually fix your solar panels. More difficult than that is going to be some of the wiring that's in your charge controllers and your inverter. What you can do to mitigate that is, what I've done in my home is wire all of the lighting, the refrigerating, freezers, fans, and things like that for DC. So if you have a 12-volt battery bank, you can use 12-volt lighting and refrigerators very easily. 24-volt is fairly easy to find. And then 48 volts is a little bit more difficult, but I think with the online marketplace now, you could probably even do a 48-volt lighting system for your home. Why would you want to do that? Because then your inverter, which on the slideshow, the inverters on your left side, you look at those batteries, that's your most complicated piece of electronics there. So if your inverter got fried, but your house is wired for DC, then you don't need the inverter, because the inverter makes AC electricity. And so then at that point, if you had your diodes for your solar panels and you've got some extra charge controllers, which are less expensive than an inverter, then you could still have power. And having extra circuit breakers and things like that would work. But in an emergency, sometimes you might skip circuit breakers. So diodes and extra charge controllers, and I think you could recover from an EMP. All right, and so I don't mind it. We have time, so I'll go ahead and dive into this next question, which would be, about your rainwater. And so you're talking about a sustainable home, rainwater collection. If you've seen some of my other videos, I have rainwater collection, or at the homesteadranger.com website, you'll see some of my rainwater collection material. And so how do you cover over a rainwater tank so that your contents don't get contaminated with fallout? And the way that that works is you need to create space between your water and the fallout. And the other thing to keep in mind is that fallout is really also a question of magnitude and your location. And so you're talking about radioactive dust, basically, that would contaminate an area and would actually relatively quickly be washed away by rain and things like that. So the key is during that time period between a nuclear attack and the time it takes for the rain to wash out the actual radioactive dust and things like that, the water needs to be completely sealed off. All right. So your cover on your rainwater tanks needs to be robust enough to where if let's say you're within 20, 30 miles of a military installation that were attacked, then your cover needs to be able to withstand things like high winds, all right, maybe even rain that's like a driving sideways rain or something like that. And if your cover can withstand that, and you're not, obviously right on top of a place that's been directly attacked by a nuclear weapon, then you actually could cover your water. You prevent the the radioactive dust from getting in your water, and then say potentially within a month, most of that fallout is going to be washed out. It actually gets washed out of the sky by precipitation. The rain clouds will wash that out, and then washed off of the ground surface within about a month. If you can keep your water protected, keep your food protected, keep your animals and yourself protected, then I'm not going to say there's no contamination. And again, it's a magnitude question, but that first month is critical. And then after that, it's going to be more a question of how big the attack was, and if you are able to, if it's big enough to stop photosynthesis, in the area that you're living in. So hope that answers the question. I've got a 200-page draft for a book about that, so answering it briefly is really tough. All right, so I think I'd like to go ahead and move on to some of the next portions where we talk about, so I left off talking a little bit about biological capital and basically building your soil and being a steward over your land and taking care of your land on a macro scale in your pastures. And I want to also just mention one of our favorite topics, which is how we do that on a micro scale, specifically raised bed gardens and orchards. And there's not any kind of complicated formula for this or anything. We simply made a big wooden box out of slabs of cedar on our farm, and we try to put it close to the house so that you can go out there and work on it every day. You're not going to forget about it. It's right there. And you fill it with really good dirt. On ours, we made it about 30 inches tall, and about half of the bottom is sand and gravel for good drainage, and then the top 18 inches or so is really good soil. A lot of it's partially composted. And just a quick note, if you're using animal manure, I like to season that animal manure for at least a year so that you don't end up with any kind of parasites in there. But about a 50% 12-month-old seasoned animal manure with some good river bottom soil is a great combination. And then as many coffee grounds as you can round up and put in there, I think is very helpful. And the types of fertilizers we use would be blood meal, bone meal, and then there's also the phosphate, which is like an ashes type thing, or charcoal type thing. So blood, bone, and charcoal meal is a really great organic fertilizer that we've used, and that's pretty much it. And then the only thing that we've done on there that I've had a lot of comments about as far as technique is whether or not to use plastic to line your big box or cover it in the wintertime. And I haven't found a great solution, or I haven't applied a great solution. Although I will say that if you really were against using plastic to line that box, you might think about using clay or something like that. But in our case, we use plastic, and then by covering the raised beds with the rebar, either rebars or these are block ladders in the middle photo, and you can buy at a hardware store, and you can just bend those over, put the plastic over, staple it. And by doing that, we'll have vegetables into December. We always have carrots. We always have lettuce, salad into December. We can have tomatoes and cucumbers into November. Sometimes we can have butternut squash into December as well. You can definitely have kale and spinach and rucola into December. And then we normally have to take a break January, February, and March. We're out there planting and growing salad and carrots again. And then, by April, then we're able to get tomatoes and peppers and cucumbers and things like that. If you want to see more information about how we built those raised beds, I actually made a couple of videos of it at homesteadranger.com. There's more information about actually the materials I used. I even have a video that's sort of a what do they call it, time-lapse video of how I made one of those. And so that's the raised beds, and it's really simple and straightforward and worth the time. So much bang for your buck on something like that. I highly recommend it. And then on the orchards, what I would say about the orchards is plant early, and everyone kind of knows that. If you get a piece of property, immediately plant. The one thing I wish that we would have done more of is pay more attention to the varieties of fruits that other people have had success with in your area. For example, in our area, we planted a bunch of, I think it was Fuji apples and maybe a Red Delicious or something, and we had terrible problems with cedar rust blight, and then later went back and planted a variety called Arkansas Black, which is resistant to the blight, and those have done well. So that's something that I would have liked to have talked to neighbors and done earlier. Other things that did really well in our area would be Montmorency cherries and chestnuts. We use the Asian chestnuts. We have Asian chestnuts now that are 30 feet tall or so. Sometimes the frost will kill them because we're in a continental climate. And so in the middle of the continent, you get extreme cold fronts that come through in the early and even late spring. And so that's a problem. So keep that in mind. Keep your individual local climates in mind. So someone's asking about our zone that we're in. We're actually in zone 6B here in the Missouri Ozarks. And so, other than being a continental climate with late frosts and early frosts, you'll have heat waves. You'll have extreme humidity. I think last summer we hit 85% humidity for about a week, and you'll have cold spells in the winter. So, in the summer, you're looking at sometimes above 100 degrees. And then sometimes in the winter, you'll get, 10 below is kind of our lower limit. And so it's challenging. It's not like these places like Italy or California where you have the ocean kind of hopefully regulating your temperatures a little bit. So, but that's how we've dealt with it. The raised beds have been super effective because they can be covered and uncovered and watered easily, and you could really focus on the fertility and the weeding of your raised beds, especially if they're up at that height. And check out those more at the homesteadranger.com, a lot about our raised beds and how we did that. All right. So kind of rounding it all up and summing up, this idea of biological capital, which is sort of my favorite topic, is how do you build the biological capital? So what we try to do here was, yes, we had to figure out how to make it work financially, but in the end, what's your end product? Is it to make just more money, to have the money in the bank? In our case, it was to have the biological capital. So biodiversity, fertility, rich microbiotic activity going on in your soil. And the number one thing I could say and how we did that was in a situation where you have pastures or even where you're farming, you don't want to spray the herbicides. And we're just now at the tip of the iceberg about learning, as far as learning the negative effects of these herbicides. And I think what it boils down to on an individual scale, what it does to your body is the herbicides will actually destroy your microbiome in your body. And that's going to leave you more exposed, to diseases and cancer and things like that. Because if an herbicide is designed to destroy plants, it may not destroy the animal part of your body, but you have microflora, which are microscopic plants that are part of your body, a whole population. So you don't want to do that. And it does this, and those herbicides will do the same thing to your farm. You have a microbiome in all of your soil on your farm. And so that's something that we've never done. We figured out how to manage the vegetation with no herbicides. And that is why you have the cattle and the goats, whose diets are varied and they complement each other, and they eat pretty much all types of vegetation on the farm. Another thing that has turned out to be biological capital on our farm is that because of the biodiversity, we have plants that have medicinal properties and deworming properties, and those actually take the place of expensive medications for the animals. So by not destroying the biodiversity, then you're actually taking care of the health of the animals and preventing health problems. It's kind of like having, I guess it's really popular now. They have some of these health places that will serve you like an acai bowl, or places that have superfoods in their salads, like you'll have a salad with blueberries or walnuts, things like that. Well, having that sort of superfood diet for your animals and your soil is super important, and you don't want to kill that stuff off with herbicides. Another thing really big has been the use of legumes everywhere on our farm. Doesn't matter if it's around our yard, on the sides of our raised beds, in our pastures. We've tried to grow as many legumes as possible, and I'm talking about clover, I'm talking about alfalfa. There's a lot of wild legumes, such as tick trefoil and things like that. There are trees that have properties of legumes. There's sort of a tree-like legume would be an acacia or a locust tree. And so those are great. You want to encourage all of those things because they're going to add nitrogen into your soil. Then you don't have to have the chemical nitrogen fertilizer, which has negative side effects. And legumes is the key for that. Another thing that you can do is you don't want to eradicate all the woody plants on your farm ecosystem, because a lot of those have super deep roots. And when those are harvested by your livestock, what it's going to do is those deep roots on the plants bring the things like phosphorus and a lot of micronutrients to the surface. So that's extracting it, actually like mining it from the geological layers beneath your land. So these trees and woody vegetations bring those nutrients up, and then your livestock, especially like your goats, will eat those. You can compost them also, but if you want to supercharge it, then you have your livestock out there eating some of that vegetation, some of those leaves, and then that manure is full of micronutrients. So it's really, really supercharging the fertility on your land. And then finally, building that biological capital. Use native warm season grasses and a lot of native vegetation, and that will feed your livestock in a balanced way so that you have certain vegetation that goes dormant, something else comes up. So you're taking advantage of these natural cycles. So you got like a warm season grass, you've got a cool season grass, and then for almost the entire year, you have that nutrient cycle continuing, the decomposition continuing, and basically you're composting on the macro level and the micro level. So you got a really good question here. This is a perfect time for it. Did you intentionally seed medicinal plants, or were they present naturally? So the answer is both, really. Some of them were present naturally, and some of them we seeded. And one of the things that we did, we didn't, I wouldn't say that the government programs for conservation are something that you have to have, you can't do without to make it financially, but it's a really good incentive if you work with some of your departments of conservation to seed some of these plants, um, and encourage some of your medicinal plants, some of your what they would call forbs. So examples here in the Ozarks of things that were already present in our pastures would be like the echinacea, and I'm talking about that coneflower, that pink echinacea that people drink in their tea, and it's super. It has these great antioxidants in it, and it's going to keep you healthy during the winter. And yeah, that's something that's here naturally, but we also seeded even more of it. And there's then different types of coneflowers that we seeded. You'll see a little bit of butterfly plant out here, which encourages your pollinators, like butterflies, obviously, but the butterfly plant is like an orange milkweed, and there's other milkweeds, and those are present. And then we seeded more other pollinator pollinator encouraging plants would be like your Indian paintbrush. You have different wild indigos. And so, yeah, so a lot of these, we would see them on a small level, and then we work with our local Department of Conservation to plant even more of those and try to introduce some varieties that we weren't seeing, such as actually the Indian paintbrush was not something that we would see hardly anywhere, as well as like your wild indigos and some of your varieties of milkweed. So yeah, that's something that I would encourage you to do. And it's going to benefit not only the pollinators on your land, which encourage all of those flowering trees and fruits and plants that you need, but also just out there is forage that increases the diversity of the livestock diet. So finally, I think I'll just kind of mention how you put all this together, and the way that you put and you make it work so that your homestead can be both sustainable, good for long-term survival, but then also, building a system where your biological capital means really you're going to be okay financially on a homestead. That's the real trick, because if you do it successfully for 10, 15 years, and then financially you fail, or you fail because of low fertility, or your land is exhausted, then that's not sustainable ultimately. So how do you make it so that the biological capital and your stewardship turns into long-term financial capital? Why does that actually work? Why does it make sense into the future? Well, one, because you've reduced your need for fertilizer and manure inputs. So you've eliminated the need because you've planted legumes, you've allowed your woody plants to bring up your micronutrients, and you've done your proper rotation of your pastures so that you're composting everything. And then, of course, on a small scale, you've limited and you've contained your raised bed gardens into a small enough area that it's manageable. The idea there is to make it manageable for yourself, okay? The second way that you make the biological capital turn into something that's financially feasible is that you don't have to spend money on herbicide either. No fertilizer, you're not buying herbicides. Instead, you bought something that's going to make money for yourself, increase the fertility of your land, and that's an animal like goats that's out there harvesting the micronutrients off the woody plants, returning those to the soil, and then also, like in our case, a lot of those goats go out to homes where kids are showing them at fairs and using them to start their own herds and breed their own herds. In addition, you can make your biological capital turn into financial capital when you don't have to buy as much hay. So by rotating your animals on your pasture and doing the management intensive grazing, or the labor intensive grazing, as we like to call it, then you can actually make it so you're not spending money on hay, but instead they're out there working for their food, and you're rotating them through their pastures. And I'll just mention that you also want to make sure that the vegetation that's on that piece of land is diverse. So you have some of your pastures might do better in the cool season and some are doing better in the warm season. And that's kind of where your stewardship and your actually hard work has to come in, and then it will pay off later. And then I see another question on here. What kind of fencing do you use for the goats? Because you want to be able to rotate the goats. And it is true what they say, if water can get through a fence, then goats can also get through a fence. I will say that over time, it's gotten easier because we have a herd now where they were all boarded raised here. Sometimes we would bring in goats from other farms and they'd be trying to figure out how to get back home. And so that was tough. But as far as fencing goes, we sometimes whenever you have these lofty goals and it's causing you a lot of stress, you sometimes have to do the counterintuitive thing and do less. And people are like, what are you talking about? You're going to work less in your farm and you expect that to bring you more? And yeah, so what we did was when we first were rotating goats, we have something like 15 paddocks of fenced areas that we can rotate on, but we wanted to rotate goats daily like we did with the cattle. So we had that electric netting, and that might work for some people, but our goats were trying to die in the electric netting, and they were trying to actually get tangled up in it and choke themselves. So we said, you know what, this is hard on everybody. It's hard on the goats, it's hard on us, it's stressful. So instead of doing a daily rotation with goats, we use our bigger paddocks and we rotate them just, maybe once every week, once every 2 weeks. And when they're having their kids and stuff, we just let them stay in the barn, and that's perfectly fine too. So we're doing sometimes the solution that doesn't seem like it's perfect, or may not seem like what you've seen in a sustainability textbook, but it's workable. So you have to be pragmatic. If something's not working, then you stop. And then as far as the specific type of fence for goats, I like woven wire. I like 4 foot tall woven wire with 1 strand of barbed wire on top of it. So that woven wire, if you had the money to spend, the 4x4 squares are great. We have a lot more fence than that. So we have the graduated squares. They start off at like 8 inches or something, and they go up. But we do like the woven wire. And I've known some people that do use electric wire with their goats, and I've seen that work, but it better be really hot and they better get trained on it, because I've also seen a goat jump through the air where they're not grounded, go through electric wires and come out the other side. And so it's just a matter of training. But yeah, woven wire for us. Another question is someone says, yeah, chicken electric fencing worked for them when the goats were smaller, and then they got bigger and they would just bulldoze through that wire. And yeah, we had a very similar experience, and it was very unpleasant. I did not have a goat die from the fence, but I had one that was so stressed that had some serious health problems later from getting tangled in the fence. That was really unpleasant. So, but I do think that that you should use a rule of thumb when you're fencing goats, which is if you look at the parasite cycle of the different worms that like to live partially in the goat intestine, if you can keep them off of pasture for 30 days, then that's enough for those parasites to die out due to their natural cycle. And so that's not really a long time. So if you're moving them once a week and you have 5 paddocks, then that gives a little more than 30 days rest for each paddock. So that's something to keep in mind. So my recommendation is use metal woven wire fencing. If you can afford the 4x4 squares, awesome. If not, the other ones will work. And then rotate them, making sure they're off of each pasture for a month. And it's better to have 5 pastures at a minimum, I would say. One quick note: if you have the cheaper fence like us, and the goats tend to get their heads stuck in the little squares of the fencing, it's a training issue. You can actually duct tape a stick across their horns for probably a week, and I don't know if it's because it's uncomfortable for them to try to push their head through there, or if they're tired of getting made fun of and laughed at by the other goats because of the stupid looking stick. But you can do that, and then rather than have your goat stick their head and get stuck all the time in the fence, then they'll be trained. So that's what I recommend. All right. And then again, one of the biggest successes on our farm, you can see on the slide, it says stacking. So stacking different enterprises. We stack the cattle and the goats, and we also cut hay, which is a more conventional side of our operation that I do. But yeah, by stacking it, the enterprises, you're making sometimes 2 or 3 times as much, financial gain off of per acre of your land. And I know Joel Salatin likes to stack chickens on there, and we've done that with some success. But like I said earlier, the chickens are mostly for our use, and the predators are so savage in the Ozarks that you better have a really great predator program if you're going to be throwing chickens in there. Yeah, Rebecca said, I hate the electric netting for livestock and poultry because of all the accidents. And yeah, the electric netting, yeah, we didn't have a great experience with it. In fact, we sold a lot of it. We had a lot more and sold most of it. We still keep it to protect the raised beds from like groundhogs. And then Stefano mentioned that the electric fencing for cows is awesome. And we've totally had that experience. Just one strand, like the poly wire, will work for most cows, 90%, 99%. And if there's a cow that has such a terrible attitude that it wants to get through that fence, then it might need to move along and find a different farm. But normally one strand. And so the cattle, we totally will rotate and give them 1 day of grass at a time. And it works with just the one poly wire. And that's why we're able to do it, because you just reel it up. The next day you put it out there. There's a video or 2 of that on the homesteadranger.com website as well. Yeah, Rebecca said, yeah, the Angus, they might be a little more rambunctious, and there's one that's out there right now, one of our black Angus. She needs to get off my farm because she keeps jumping the fences, and I don't want her to have to be a bad influence on everybody else. So, okay, so I probably should wrap it up. I think we just hit 1 hour. I really appreciate it. And so I'll just pose the question to everyone else, is sustainable agriculture economically feasible in the Ozarks? And I think that hopefully is the question that I've answered. The answer is a resounding yes. And it's the same question is, can you create biological capital in the Ozarks by using these techniques? And the answer is yes, you really can do it. You can do it successfully. I think that we've adapted it well to our area, and it's been good for our family. It's been great for the land, and I highly recommend it. And I just thank everybody for checking us out today. And if you want to check out more information on homesteadranger.com, there's a lot more info there. And of course, there's the book about the whole story and how we did it, Thrive in the Coming Dark Age, How to Build the Ultimate Survival Homestead. Amazon's the place. You can just Google it. It'll come up, but Amazon's the best place to get that. And I'm happy to answer any questions, so anyone can reach out anytime if you think of questions later too.
Hey, Josh, thank you so much, and great presentation. And I think we need to have you back here, especially for the more of the prepping side as well, because you can go very depth into that. It was kind of fun.
Yeah, we barely touched on any of that, and that's really one of my favorite topics. So I'd love to come and talk to you about that as well sometime.
Awesome. So we'll get you in the books. We'll get you again. And thank you, everybody, for joining, asking questions, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, everyone.